I have a lot to cover today, so I'm going to dispense with any self-introduction. Those of you that may not have been here yesterday have the opportunity to secure some videos from Brother Franklin and his team, and should you require some more information about things that I might be referring to in this presentation that you don't quite understand, perhaps the presentation from yesterday will be beneficial for you. And I'd like to suggest that for those of you that are interested in any of the presentations, that you check with the young ladies downstairs and get yourself on the list for all of the presentations that are being recorded here today and yesterday and through the rest of the time that we have. The title of my talk this afternoon, By Graft or by Craft. I think we can probably speculate a little bit about what I'm referring to here. We know that as Christians in spiritual Israel, that we've all been grafted in to the faith, and that we have the opportunity for the saving grace of Christ because of that graft. And we know too that we have the opportunity for a future, for hope, for eternal life because of that. However, there is another force on this planet right now that seeks to determine our fate by craft, and that's a bit what I'm going to be talking about today. I know that I'm going to arouse a lot of curiosity among you with the talks that I'm giving here this weekend, and I want to encourage all of you that would like to maybe do some investigating on your own or finding follow-up information to make a note of this website address. This is a website that I maintain. There's not a lot of information on it that I put up, but there are a tremendous number of links here to the sources of information that I make use of in these talks and also in the classes that I teach. And many of the questions that I'm going to cover today have answers, either from myself later. If you choose to approach me and discuss it, I'll be happy to share with you what I know, but I can direct you to the sources through this one site. This is a compilation that has taken a lot of research and a lot of work to pull together, but we do have this wonderful resource of information available to us. How much longer it will be available to us, we don't know. And that's why I feel that a sense of urgency, if you will, about these messages that I'm sharing with you. Because for the time being, we still have access to this information. The time may come, and the time may come soon, when that will not be the case. Much of what I'm going to share with you is not going to be available in the traditional press. We consider here in the United States that we have a free press, and anything we want to know, we can just pick up a newspaper or turn into the local news channel and find out. But unfortunately, that system too is no longer reliable as a source of truthful information about what is going on. And sometimes we have to look to some other resources, and for now, most of those resources are electronic. You know, I encounter in many of our meetings, particularly among the older people, of whom I am now one. I'm starting to get solicitations from the American Association of Retired Persons, and I know that now that I'm more than half a century on the planet, that I qualify for that too. I still don't think of myself in those terms, but many of us have kind of struggled with the concept of electronic technology and whether or not learning the computer is worthwhile, or email or internet or all of that. But it is a tool for our use, and in these final days there are resources and opportunities too for communication among ourselves that didn't exist just a few years ago. And it is a wonderful tool if it's properly used. So I encourage those of you that choose to make use of this website to please do so. If you have suggestions or recommendations, there's a link where you can directly email me from this website, and I would be happy to either answer your questions directly, or if you have information or input about the content on the website, I'd be happy to hear from you on that too. We'll see if our technology works a little better today than yesterday. I'm praying that it will, because I think the graphics will be helpful. I have a lot of ground to cover today, so I'm going to move kind of quickly through some things. And if you have questions about something that I point out, please don't hesitate to raise your hand. I'm more than willing to stop and address something specifically if I leave you in confusion because of the speed with which I'm going to cover things. My desire is not to confuse, but to clarify some of these issues. I want to read just a scripture here to start with from 1 Kings 19:19. This is when Elijah was called to go and find Elisha. And where did he find him when he was searching for him? He found him plowing in the field with 12 oxen. Now, I don't know, I'm not one that has worked a lot with animals, but I cannot fathom coordinating the activities of 12 oxen at one time. And that indicates to me that Elisha had some experience in doing this, that he had probably labored long and hard and developed skill in accomplishing this task. And it also indicates to me as well that he came from a pretty wealthy family. And since he came from a pretty wealthy family, he probably had a choice as to whether he was standing behind those oxen on that particular day or not. This indicates to me, too, that he had an appreciation for the value of this type of work that perhaps we don't have in our modern society. Thomas Jefferson wrote some words to a couple of his friends that I wanted to share with you today. And the first one is from a letter that he wrote to a man named John Jay, and he said that the cultivators of the earth are the most valuable citizens. The most valuable citizens. They are the most vigorous, the most independent, the most virtuous, and they are tied to their country and wedded to its liberty and interests by the most lasting bonds. In 1787, he wrote to his close friend, James Madison, "I think our governments will remain virtuous for many centuries, as long as they remain chiefly agrarian." Do we have an agrarian society any longer? Do we have virtuous government any longer? Prophetic words from a politician. I want to quickly go through a little bit of history here of agriculture, particularly in the United States, just to set us up for some concepts that we're going to be talking about a little bit later. But early on in Americans' history, farmers were very self-sufficient. I don't like using the term self-reliant because none of us can rely on ourselves, but we can provide for our needs and we can be self-sufficient in the sense that we can meet those needs. And early on in America's agricultural agrarian society, farmers were very autonomous. They produced their own seed, they saved it from year to year, they used inputs from their own farm for their production, and their farms were family farms that were very diversified. None of them specialized in only one crop. They didn't have just one basket full of eggs, if you will. They had a variety of different things, so that if one aspect of their agriculture failed, they would have perhaps success in another and an opportunity to sustain themselves. Any of you know where the concept of an acre came from? We use an acre as a unit of measurement for land. It's 43,560 square feet, or a square that's roughly 208 feet on each side. And that term actually comes from biblical times, because that was about the amount of land that a yoke of oxen and one man could plow and turn and prepare for seed in one day. That's where the term acre came from. In the early 1900s, the scale of farm sizes began to increase, and we started to develop crop specialization. This was particularly apparent here in the South, where cash crops were grown, primarily tobacco and cotton. Transportation began facilitating the transportation of products over long distances. We had markets established in Europe, and much of the product, even within our own country, was shipped great distances from the farm to where it was used. Overseas markets developed and expanded, and farm workers started to arrive from offshore. Chinese in the West, Filipinos in the West, Mexicans. Many of the island people came here to the East Coast, and we know as well that many were enslaved from Africa and brought to our shores to accomplish the tasks here. As the industrial age started to take hold, farming became mechanized, and populations began migrating to urban areas. As industry revolutionized and as circumstances in the country began to change, fewer and fewer people were now working on the farms as machines took over their work. We also began off-farm inputs of seed and fertilizer. The first hybridized varieties of seed were starting to arrive in the marketplace, and farmers could not save those seeds from one season to the next. I'll explain a little bit about that in a few moments. But farmers were no longer the self-sufficient, autonomous economic packages that they once were, and they began to rely on others. Rail transportation and storage facilities grew, and an important aspect of agriculture, bank financing of farm businesses began to increase. As farmers wanted to expand their operations, they often needed investment capital, and this investment capital came in the forms of loans that were taken out against the next year's crop cycle. And this began a long series of financial institution involvement in American agriculture. World War I came along, and people were removed from farms to the war effort, to industry, to help support the war effort in Europe, and also to fight the battles in Europe. We had many technology improvements that occurred during this period of time too, particularly with machinery and equipment. The commercialization of fertilizers began shortly after World War I, and primarily because so much work had been done in the field of explosives. Many of the explosives that were used during World War I were based on ammonium nitrate, which became a very popular fertilizer shortly after the war. And we also had the hybridization of seed taking place, and new markets for that seed were expanding after World War I. The Dust Bowl of the 1930s actually kindled something that has become a major trend in agriculture, which is the no-till movement. I'm not going to elaborate a lot on that, just to say that it was primarily the results of farming practices in the Midwest that led to such widespread devastation of the Dust Bowl, and that was an economic experience that the American economy just did not want to sustain anymore. And part of the reason for this was that most of the prairies had had their sod turned under and had been plowed into a very fine plantable soil which lent itself very easily to wind erosion. The types of winds that caused the Dust Bowl circumstance were not unique to the 1930s. We know from records of indigenous peoples, for example, that these winds were not all that uncommon, and we've seen winds much like them since the 1930s without the devastation. And the primary reason that the land was so devastated during that period of time were simply farming practices. So this led to a change in farming practices called the no-till movement, which really didn't take hold until the late 1960s and early 1970s, but part of the no-till movement involves planting crops without tilling the ground at all. And what made this possible was the development of herbicides to control weeds. We no longer had to go into the fields prior to planting and turn the soil to reduce weed populations. We could now control them with chemicals. World War II came along, we had further industrialization and the commercialization of pesticides. That same company that I spoke to you about yesterday, IG Farben, had among its subsidiaries a corporation named BASF, and there was a scientist that worked at BASF that came up with the first organochlorine and organophosphate pesticides that became popular in agriculture, and this was a direct offshoot from research that was done during World War II to find the most efficient and economic means to eliminate human beings. Urban migration continued both during the war and after the war, as the economic resurgence in the post-war years led to more industrialization. Many more people moved off the families into an urban environment, and we had a lot of social reconstruction that occurred because of World War II as well. The most notable being the movement of women into the workforce. We know that women were called to serve during the war years, to function in manufacturing jobs and other areas of industry which were previously occupied solely by men. And after their taste of labor and the independence that provided to some women and the economic independence that it gave to some women, that trend also continued after World War II and led to, in some degree, to what we called the Feminist Movement. In the early 1970s, this man, Dr. Norman Borlaug, received the Nobel Prize for Peace, in part because of his part, the role that he played in what has come to be called the Green Revolution. The Green Revolution essentially was a revolution not only in agricultural technology, but also the way that crops were hybridized and produced for specific characteristics that made them conducive to the new technology that was now available. Examples that I can give you come from wheat and corn and rice varieties that were all bred to have a shorter stature, for example, so that the harvesters, when they moved through the fields, would not have so much straw to deal with, that the plants themselves were engineered in a way that made them more functional and practical for the equipment that had been developed to process those crops. Dr. Borlaug in particular is given a great deal of credit for heading off a tremendous famine in India during the 1960s. It's estimated by some that he saved as many as 1 billion lives, or I'm sorry, yes, 1 billion lives from starvation because of his participation in this green revolution, which led to tremendous increases in yield and the production of many of our food staple crops. This also was a period of time when we had dramatic increases in the use of chemicals on farms. Very specific, specialized chemicals were developed for virtually every class and type of crop that was grown and every type of pest that might cause problems with those crops. Now, during this whole period of time, too, people were continuing to migrate away from the farms into other jobs, into other economic environments. And I wanted to point this graphic out to you because there's a pretty startling statistic at the bottom of this page. You can see what the farm population was from 1790 to the year 2000 here. I have figures for the year 2004, but I haven't posted them on this slide yet. But as you can see, in the year 2000, farmers made up 1.4% of the labor force. Today, it's actually about 0.9% or slightly less of the labor force. And this number, even in itself, is a little bit misleading because what the government terms a farmer is anyone that files his income tax and claims farm income. And that can include people that grow as little as $1,000 a year worth of farm products. So in reality, the people that are responsible for producing our food is a much, much smaller number than even that 0.9%. Walmart, on the other hand, comprises about 1.15% of our labor force. And what this tells us is there are actually more Walmart employees right now in America than there are people involved in producing food for you. And this doesn't just mean farmers. When we talk about farmers or the farm sector of the labor force, this includes all those businesses that support the farmers, such as the chemical companies, the fertilizer companies, the trucking industries that move the crops from the field to the grain elevators, the processing facilities. Anything that's involved in our food production up to the retail level is included in this 1.4% number that's here. So in reality, very, very few people are growing the food for all of us here in America. And why is that a problem? Well, it's a problem because those very, very few people wield the power of choice that you and I would otherwise have if we were growing that food ourselves. We've relinquished that choice. This is a book that I read by a writer that I particularly enjoy. Wendell Berry resides in Kentucky, and he's a Christian, not a Seventh-day Adventist Christian, but most of his writing is secular writing about agriculture, and he wrote this book called The Unsettling of America, Culture and Agriculture. And in this book, he points out to some of the social disease, if you will, that's affected the United States. And one of the reasons that I'm pointing this out here today is because it's always fun for me when I run across secular writers or writers from some other segment of society than Seventh-day Adventism that seem to have come to the same conclusions that we can find in the spirit of prophecy. And the conclusions that he comes to in this book are right in line with what we find from Sister Ellen G. White. One of the things that he points to as a serious problem is the corporate concentration of an economic power in agriculture. And again, the serious result of this is that it limits our choices in profound ways. He's seen the rapid decline in rural American economies and populations as a very destructive force on our society. I think all of us can agree with that. The growth of the supermarket and superpowers in retailing have also had a huge impact on what we find available and impacting the potential choices that we have about how we eat and what we feed ourselves. Now, I know that many of us here are somewhat interested in some products at our local stores that aren't readily available. I know, for example, that we don't like to use butter or margarine, but there are a couple of spread products that my wife and I make use of, Earth Balance being one of them. That's a hard product to find in most commercial supermarkets, so we have to rely on some specialty stores often for the products that we use. As we continue to see this increase in power among these retailers, fewer and fewer of those alternative sources of products exist. So now we're left with a very small network of availability for many of the things that we use. And many of the things that we use today we have to find only from mail order services. And this is only as viable as the economics that allows this business to take place. And if Walmart decides to jump on the bandwagon and start to carry some of the products that we make use of that are a little bit out of the mainstream and undercuts the price for all those other independents, they'll be out of business overnight too. And before long, we'll have a situation where we've got one major retailer controlling most of the products that are in the marketplace. Not based on your choice or my choice, but based on the profitability of that choice for that particular retailer. I've seen some information in the last few months that looks as if it might come to fruition, and that is that within the next 3 years, there are only going to be 2 major food retailers in the United States, simply because of the tendency of these larger corporations to buy up their competitors. We're seeing more and more mergers, and it's anticipated that in 2 or 3 years there will only be 2 in the United States, and those 2 will be under the parent corporation of Safeway and under the parent corporation of Walmart. There will be other stores under different names and labels, but they'll be controlled essentially by those 2 companies. Massive corporate farms with specialized production begin to displace the family farmer. Farms today are very highly specialized. This is another element of the industrialization of America that has occurred, and we talked about this. I know Brother Easton mentioned this earlier this morning too, about in our educational processes how the worldly concept of education seems to lead to a higher and higher sense of specialization in order to acquire success. The concept of a well-rounded education, or exposure to many different concepts, ideas, strategies, tasks, and undertakings, is not something that's valued in the world any longer. We see people that want to have a higher and higher degree and a higher and higher degree of specialization in what they do. And this has become a serious problem because we now have a class of people, even in agriculture, that no longer know how to farm. We have people that know how to operate the machinery. We have people that know how to calibrate the pesticides. We know people that know how to analyze the soil for certain properties, but it's very rare to find a farmer that has all of these skills incorporated into one package. Erosion of farmland and environmental pollution have become greater issues, and this also has led to the no-till movement, and mass production of crops lowers farmers' prices to the point now where farmers derive a large portion of their income in a way that you probably haven't really considered as being part of your food bill. The government has had a policy, particularly since the 1970s and the oil crisis of the 1970s, of keeping food prices low. Early in 1973, an organization called OPEC imposed an oil embargo on the United States. I know many of us are old enough to remember this situation. And gas prices doubled and tripled literally overnight. Quite literally, it happened overnight. This had a huge impact on the cost of milk. And the price of milk and bread in grocery stores went up commensurately. It almost doubled too. And people all over the country were alarmed and shocked, not only at the increase in the cost of fuel, but the increase in the cost of food. And in order to stem the political backlash that came from that kind of discontent, the government instituted a policy of subsidies, wherein farmers would be subsidized if the cost of their crop, or if the price for their crop fell below the cost of production, then the government would pay the difference, so that the farmer was essentially guaranteed that he would get a price for his crop that would at least meet his cost of production every year. What this means, brothers and sisters, is that when we go to the grocery store today and we buy our cornflakes, the price that we're paying for the box of cornflakes does not reflect the actual cost of producing that box of cornflakes. The difference in that cost we pay in the way of our income taxes every year. And this is a hidden food cost that most of us don't recognize, and something that I really want to remind those of you that are concerned about buying organic food, consider. Because when we're buying an unhealthful, commercially produced box of, I'm going to say it, Kellogg's cornflakes, we're buying an inferior product for a lower price, but we're paying more for that in the way of our income taxes. So if we consider this in calculating the difference between the cost of organic food and the cost of commercially produced food, there's almost a parity. It's really not that significantly different. The only reason I put this slide up here today is because it reminds me of home. This is an almond orchard in Durham, California, where I was raised, and this time of year, just about today, those orchards look just like that. It's full bloom season in the almond orchards in Northern California. But part of the reason that I wanted to show this slide is to show you just how technical and specialized agriculture has become. These rows are perfectly spaced. You may not be able to discern it in this photograph, but right beneath the trees there's a strip of land that's been sprayed with an herbicide to control weeds. We've got a green strip down the middle. We've got a drip hose laying at the base of those trees. Over the course of the life of this particular crop that's blooming right now, these trees will probably have no fewer than 10 or 15 pesticide applications made to them. The harvesting of these trees will be done with very expensive mechanical equipment. The whole concept of nut pickers and fruit pickers is an ancient concept. All of that is done mechanically these days. And this is an example of what I mean by specialized agriculture. These are rice fields in Northern California. I was talking to a sister earlier this morning that I found lived not very far from me when I was in this, there she is, in this part of the country. In fact, the ranch that you lived on is in right off to the right-hand side of this picture. You might be able to pick it out. Those are the Sutter Buttes in the background. But these are rice fields in Northern California where a small farm consists of about 2,500 acres, and almost all of the work is done by aircraft, with the exception of little tillage early in the year and harvesting. And what that implies is that man's foot very rarely treads this land that is producing our food. We've separated ourselves technologically even from the act of farming any longer. One of my jobs when I worked in Northern California was to be that man who was on foot, but my reason for being out in those fields was to look for pests and weeds to kill with various toxic methods. The schism between society, agriculture, and industry profoundly changed America's eating habits. We weren't any longer eating food that was locally produced, that was fresh, that had living qualities to it, and global markets began to influence the availability of many different things in our array of nutritional choices at the grocery store. Today, or yesterday, my brother and I drove into town. When Brother Easton and I drove into town, we stopped at the Ingalls food store down here, and we're presented with an incredible array of different things from all over the United States, nay, all over the world that we could choose from for our lunch yesterday. Many of those things are totally out of season here now. Many of those things had traveled thousands of miles to reach the shelves of that Ingalls store. And the only way that can happen, brothers and sisters, if any of you have had gardens and grown fresh produce and tried to keep it for 6 weeks and ship it for 3,000 miles, you know you're not going to have very good success at doing that. So there have to be artificial means employed in order to get the produce to hold up under those conditions. The average distance in the United States today that produce travels from where it was produced to the table is 1,670 miles. That's the average. Now bear in mind that 10% of the population of the United States lives in California, where much of the fresh produce is grown, and it only travels a distance of 100 miles or perhaps a few hundred miles there. So when we consider that, the average for our part of the country goes up considerably. And if we're transporting foods over that distance, there's only one way we can do it, and that is to treat it with pesticides. I like this label. There's a website that I have found where they have many of the old produce labels from the 40s, 50s, and 60s reproduced. And I like this one about don't worry apples. When buying, don't worry is the logo that they have there. These are apples from the Northwest, and part of the reason that you don't have to worry is that you don't have to worry about biting into a worm in them anymore because they're so heavily dosed with pesticides that nothing will live on it. Pesticide residues are a serious problem in our food system today, brothers and sisters, and even though we have a heightened awareness of the potential for this problem, we haven't done anything about it. Pesticide residues essentially contaminate every product on the grocer's shelves today, and to some degree, even organic products, and I'll explain why in a few minutes. Part of the dangers of pesticide residues is that pesticides specifically target the nervous system. They particularly target the capacity of nerve cells to communicate with one another. And this has an effect primarily on the frontal lobe of our brains. Why is that important to us in these days? It's because that's where our logic and discernment rests. If we are in a confused state, how can we discern spiritual things? The pesticide residues that are most prevalent on our food crops are actually herbicides. And I wanted to point this out because many of us think when we use the word pesticides that we're talking only about things that kill insects. Actually, the greatest pesticide residues come from herbicides, and number 2 is fungicides. Both of these, however, have similar chemistries to some of the insecticides and do cause neurotoxic damage as well. Most of the foods in our marketplace are never tested for pesticides. We have pesticide standards for imported produce and pesticide standards for what is acceptable in the American marketplace, but the enforcement capacity of the FDA and the USDA is so minimal that literally only a drop in a swimming pool worth of produce is ever tested. We really have no idea of what we're exposed to when we buy produce at the local grocery store. Until someone gets sick, until someone has a bad reaction to something that's eaten on the shelves, we really don't know that the problem exists. This is serious because all of these 3 categories of pesticides have cumulative effects, meaning that if you eat an apple that is saturated with a particular type of pesticide, you may feel a little queasy in your stomach, you may develop a little light headache or a slight amount of nausea, but those symptoms may pass over time. However, the next day when you eat another apple, those symptoms accumulate in your body. Many of these are stored in the fatty tissues of your body and actually accumulate over time until you reach a point where your body physically cannot handle that load of contamination any longer and breaks down. These are a couple of slides that show pesticides in water samples. I want us to focus particularly on the block on the left-hand side here, where it shows that 97% of all stream water samples in agricultural areas contained pesticides. Shallow groundwater, meaning wells less than 100 feet deep, 61% showed pesticide contamination. Even in undeveloped areas, this means no agriculture, no industry, no housing, 65% of all stream water samples contain pesticides. These pesticides are so prevalent in the environment today because they have been used with little discrimination on virtually every crop that's grown in the country. Another challenge that we face today, I talked a little bit about yesterday, but that's biotechnology. Most of you, when I first started talking about this subject about 4 years ago, I'd ask my listeners what a GMO was. Most of them hadn't a clue. I know that the awareness here in our country of genetically modified organisms, or GMOs, has grown dramatically in the last few years, but we are still quite ignorant of what's going on in our food supply and what products are genetically modified and what products aren't. And frankly, most of the questions that are directed towards me show to me that there is a tremendous amount of misinformation and misunderstanding about what's going on with this new technology. It's called genetic engineering by some, and I found this photograph to depict what I think of the concept of genetic engineering. It's really not engineering at all. When you understand the methods that are used for inserting genes from one species into another species, you begin to recognize that it's a very haphazard type of technology. There are many, many risks associated with this that the people performing this technology never test for and never try to assess. Consequently, the products that are produced from this type of technology also have many latent hazards that have never been analyzed or tested. This information I just updated before coming down here. Every time I do a presentation on this topic, I have to update these numbers because they're going up dramatically. To this point in time, within the United States alone, there have been 13,396 open-air field tests of genetically modified crops. 1,363 of these have been approved or released for growers commercially. That doesn't mean there are 1,363 different things out there, because there are a number of different corn varieties, for example, a number of different soybean varieties, but that is the total number of GM crops. You can see it's roughly 10% of all of the testing that they have done have been approved. This approval process, by the way, does not indicate that the crop is particularly safe, because there is no oversight about how these crops are determined to be safe or not, apart from the company's own data that they submit to the United States Department of Agriculture. To this date, 171 different crops have been tested or manipulated using genetically modified technology. 760 different characteristics have been manipulated. 976 different genes have been used, and 278 different institutions or organizations or companies have been involved in producing these things. The first genetically modified product that ever came on the market is something that I hope doesn't concern you too much, because by God's grace we've all realized that dairy products are not fit for human consumption any longer. But the first product that came into the marketplace was a bovine growth hormone, or what's called recombinant bovine growth hormone, that was manufactured and sold by Monsanto Corporation under the trade name Posilac. This growth hormone stimulated cows to produce more milk. And Monsanto essentially guaranteed to the dairy farmers of America that if they injected their cows with this growth hormone, that the cows would yield 10 to 15% more milk, and indeed they do. However, this growth hormone was never tested for its health effects on human beings. And there has been some recent research to indicate that this is a very serious health threat in terms of its potential to cause simple things like breast cancer and leukemia and lymphatic cancer. Posilac hit the marketplace in 1994. The United States is the only developed country. I used to say developed country because Mexico or Canada thought about using Posilac and then rejected it. But not only are we the only developed country that allows the use of this in the world, but none of the undeveloped countries will allow its use either, because there are no health studies to establish that it's safe. All right, this is the list that I get asked about all the time. These are the products currently on the marketplace that are approved for human consumption that have been genetically modified. This list is the list. If the foods that you eat are not on this list, it's likely that you are not consuming genetically modified food. Did you have a question, brother? Yes, yes. These are the foods that have been approved for human consumption by the United States Department of Agriculture in the United States. These things can be on your grocer's shelves in a genetically modified form. I want to call your attention particularly to the last 3 items on this list. How many of us eat enzymes or bacteria? And how do we eat them? Brothers and sisters, these are processing agents that are used in the majority of processed foods. Do you see cranberries on the list of crops that are genetically modified? No. And I enjoy drinking cranberry juice. So for a long time I took great satisfaction in knowing that I could drink my cranberry juice that was fructose free. It didn't have any corn syrup in it, so I didn't have to worry about the corn. Didn't have any other ingredients in it. It was cranberry juice. Until I discovered that the particular brand of cranberry juice that I like, which was Ocean Spray, uses a genetically modified enzyme as a clarifying agent. So even though my cranberries are not genetically modified, that the juice is made from, the juice itself does have a genetically modified constituent. As a result of these types of combinations, it's estimated now that 75 to 85% of all the processed food in our grocery stores has some genetically modified component in it. That's a lot. That's a lot. Yes, sir. Ma'am. Yes. I will answer that question in just a few minutes. That's a very good question. Yes, Tony? Perhaps. Perhaps some of the synthetics, yes. Yes. Now, let me go back to that slide for a minute. When I first started doing research on this topic, I wondered about 100% whole wheat bread. At that time, wheat had not yet been added to this list. Wheat was not an ingredient that I needed to worry about in my loaf of whole wheat bread. But I went down to my local Food Lion store and I bought a loaf of whole wheat bread, and I went through the list of ingredients on that package, and I went to the website for the manufacturer and started doing some research on the ingredients in that package and found that there were actually 11 different genetically modified components in that loaf of 100% whole wheat bread. I'm pointing this out to let you know that there is not an easy way to discern what it is that we're consuming, even if we read the labels. Because here in the U.S., there is no labeling required on genetically modified products. That distinguishes us from other parts of the developed world, such as the European Union, Australia, Japan, Korea, that require labeling on these things. But here in the U.S., we do not. I mentioned yesterday about the major seed companies in the U.S., and I wanted to point out again today that rather than that simple farmer that we had on our first slide that was autonomous and able to retain his own seed from year to year, and the thousands of seed companies that developed during the course of the Green Revolution, where seed companies were producing hybridized varieties for many different areas, these now are the big 5 seed companies in the U.S. Now, there's another company here, too, that my brother mentioned yesterday when he was flying here. He sat on the plane next to a lady that was an employee of a company called Syngenta. Syngenta is associated with BASF, so I wanted to let you know that I didn't list them separately here just for the sake of clarity. But I want to point out, too, that of these companies, we've got a couple of them on here that are direct descendants of IG Farben, and also 2 others that are closely associated to IG Farben. For those of you that weren't here yesterday, get the tape. You're going to want to know why that's the case. Our safety policy on genetically modified food in the U.S. is woefully inadequate. Part of the reason for this is the first company to develop a genetically modified product in America was Monsanto Corporation. They developed a genetically modified corn variety to resist its particular variety or product line of Roundup herbicide. When Monsanto developed this, they knew that they would be arousing public interest if they announced that this new corn variety had been genetically modified or genetically engineered or genetically manipulated or had been gene spliced. These were all terms that were kind of floating around at that time in the late 1990s. So they went to the federal government when they realized that they had this technology, they went to the federal government and they said, look, we've got this new technology for taking genes out of one species, inserting them in another species, and manifesting that, some of those characteristics in this other species. How do you want to regulate us? And the government said to them, basically, we don't have a clue. We don't know what you're doing. We don't have scientists within the government regulatory agencies that know anything about this. So essentially, you're going to have to regulate yourselves. So come up with a set of regulations, come back to us, and we'll decide whether or not we'll go for it. And in the meantime, this was during the administration of the first President Bush, and he dutifully appointed his vice president, Dan Quayle, to oversee this project and to determine a policy that we would use to determine whether things that were genetically modified were safe or not. And Dan Quayle, the man that didn't know how to spell potato, suddenly found himself charged with determining whether eating genetically modified potatoes was safe or not. Anyway, he buckled under the influence of the biotech companies who had essentially said that, well, we're genetically modifying this corn, we're putting characteristics into it that have never been there before, from an entirely different species, but it still looks like corn, it still tastes like corn, it still grows like corn. Why don't we just call it corn? And if we call it corn, we don't really need to regulate it, do we? Because it's really just like the other corn. And Dan Quayle said, well, yeah, okay, that sounds good. So the government settled on this policy, which has come to be known as substantial equivalence. Genetically modified corn looks, cooks, smells, grows, and acts just like normal corn, so it's considered substantially equivalent to regular corn, and therefore falls under a policy that the government has called GRAS, G-R-A-S, or generally regarded as safe. We don't need to regulate it as a pesticide. It's not really a pesticide, it's corn. May have pesticidal properties, but it's still corn. But it falls under this generally regarded as safe term that the government applies to it, and it's considered safe. All of the safety studies that are done with genetically modified products take place during the development stage of the product and is never further evaluated by the government. If a company submits an application to the government to test a genetically modified crop, it submits its test data on whether that crop might present a hazard or not, whether it might have properties that would cause allergic reactions among people or some other detrimental characteristic to it. It presents that information to the government, and the government decides at that point in time whether it will allow the release of this crop into the environment for testing or not. Once it does that, once the United States Department of Agriculture takes that step and issues that permit, the product is no longer regulated, meaning that it's treated just like corn. There are no follow-up health studies on any of these genetically modified products, not a single one, that is done for your benefit or my benefit to determine whether they are safe or not. The only information we are relying on is the information that the company itself has submitted. And I submit to you that that presents some very serious hazards. Now, in Europe, Asia, Australia, and the rest of the world, they have a totally different approach to the safety of genetically modified food that they call the precautionary principle. And this basically is a principle that says, genetically modified, I'm not going to believe that that's harmless until you prove to me that it's harmless. You must prove that this crop is safe for me to consume before I will consume it. So consequently, most of the studies that have been done on genetically modified food have been done overseas. And some of the research results are pretty startling. There's another element to this whole issue, too, that I want to apprise you of. This man is a man named Percy Schmeiser. He's a canola grower from Saskatchewan in Canada. Percy Schmeiser had worked on the same land all of his life, developing strains of canola seed specific to his particular circumstance and conditions, and had about 30 different varieties of canola that he would grow on his land. One summer, a couple of investigators showed up on his land from Monsanto Corporation, taking samples out of his field without his knowledge, and discovered that among his canola plants growing in his field was a variety of canola known as Roundup Ready canola. It had been genetically modified. They went to Mr. Schmeiser and said, "Mr. Schmeiser, you're growing our canola without our permission. We're going to file a lawsuit against you." Mr. Schmeiser replied, "I have never grown your canola. I've never purchased your seed. I have no idea how it got into my field, but I did not plant it. If it's in my field, your canola gene contaminated my field." So they went to court. They discovered that the most likely source of the contamination was trucks from Mr. Schmeiser's neighbors driving back and forth along the road during canola harvest, where seed would blow out of the truck and into his field, or perhaps pollen that may have blown from one field to another, contaminating his crop. Pollen, remember, carries all the genetic code of the plant itself. This case went to the Supreme Court in Canada. And guess who the Supreme Court decided for? Monsanto Corporation. They determined that the intellectual property rights of that gene that Monsanto owned superseded Mr. Schmeiser's real property rights. This has set a very dangerous precedent. By the way, there have been many similar cases here in the United States, all of which Monsanto has won. They have an army of over 500 attorneys working on cases, policing, if you will, their genetically modified crops, saying that no, doesn't matter if pollen drift occurs. Can pollen drift happen? Well, I'd say so. If you can blow a school bus for 3 miles in a tornado, I think you can blow a grain of pollen farther than the 300-foot buffer limit that's imposed by the safety regulations of the United States Department of Agriculture. Seems likely to me. This is a chart that shows the global area currently in production with genetically modified foods. The countries in green are countries that are currently working with genetically modified products growing in their soil, and many of them are also developing genetically modified products of their own, specifically China and India. This causes us some concern because we have no regulatory system whatsoever in place to deal with imported genetically modified food products. We're going to see why this is of particular interest to us when we start considering some of the other aspects of this. The 3 major crops are soy, corn, and cotton and canola that are genetically modified. These are the acreages, and this is just a timeline to show you since 1996, when the first GMO crops were approved, how quickly this technology has spread, how quickly we have gone from 0 acres to hundreds of millions of acres today. Pardon me? These are hundreds of millions of acres that are, or millions of acres that are planted to each of these various crops, and over a year's time. You can see that canola, for example, reached a peak about 1999. That's because about 90% of all the canola grown in the world right now is genetically modified, so there aren't any more canola acres to gain. On the other ones here, you see how quickly this technology is spread, particularly with soy, brothers and sisters, particularly with soy. About 85 to 90% of all the soy grown in the United States now is genetically modified. This is a chart that I pulled up from the CDC that shows rates of urticaria, which is a skin rash, anaphylaxis, a shock, food allergies, and angioedema. And I found that there's an interesting correlation between the increase in acreage of these GMO crops and the increase of many different diseases. Now, I don't have a couple of others on here that I wish were on this graph, but also when we start looking at breast cancer rates and lymphatic cancer rates and leukemia rates, we see skyrocketing rates that occur all about the same time that genetically modified food crops first hit the marketplace. Now, if we look, for example, at the red line here at skin rashes, go back to 1990, we see that the average rate was about 20 per million people. And this chart, I believe, was, 2001 was the most current information I could find. I'm waiting for the CDC to come out with some new reports. Their reports usually lag 3 to 4 years before they come out. But between 1997, 96, 97, and 2001, we see spikes in all kinds of different diseases. And now that we've had an additional 5, 6 years history to add to this, I'm very anxiously awaiting these CDC reports to see whether indeed this correlation continues to rise with the increase in GMO acreage. Potential health effects from GMOs, antibiotic resistance. I won't have time to explain all of this to you, but I want to go through this quickly because these are all real, demonstrated health effects that can occur from consumption of genetically modified food. Antibiotic resistance, anaphylaxis, allergies, asthma, cognitive disorders, Alzheimer's, Lewy body dementia, and the like. All kinds of inflammatory diseases, including lupus, arthritis, fibromyalgia, eosinophilic esophagitis. Anybody heard of that before? Guess what that is? That's an inflammation of the trachea from consuming certain types of food. It's a particular condition that was unknown before the development of genetically modified foods. Of the esophagus. I'm sorry, yes, of the esophagus. Right. Cancers, as I mentioned before, skin rashes. GMOs also have a very interesting characteristic in that they have anti-nutritive properties. Not only are they not as nutritious, but some of the elements within that food actually render other components that would otherwise be nutritious non-nutritious, if you will. Obesity, in a roundabout fashion, since you're not getting nutrition, you're eating more food, your body weight's going up, but your body is starving to death. Diabetes, low birth weight, and another one called Morgellons disease that is really quite a startling development. I don't have time to explain it, but you may look into that if you choose to. There was a GM feeding study done with rats. You know, up until the time of this study, which was just 2 years ago, no one had thought to consider what it might do to pregnant animals or to lactating animals if they consumed a GM diet. Scientists in Russia decided to take some rats and feed them GMOs, and also lactating rats and feed them GMOs and see what happened to the offspring. And what they found was a 55.6 mortality rate and a 600% higher incidence of drastically lower birth weights among the rats that were fed genetically modified soy in this particular instance. Interestingly enough, last summer we've got this article in Newsweek magazine saying that last year 1 in every 8 babies in the United States was born prematurely, a 30% increase over 1981. 30%. I was looking for the statement here. Anyway, it goes on to say basically that this increase is, oh, here it is at the bottom. He spoke with Newsweek's Karen Springen about the growing and mysterious problems. They consider this a mystery. Nobody knows why this is happening, why we have so many children that are born premature, so many children of low birth weight, and frankly, the rate of miscarriage is also very much higher in the United States. I mentioned yesterday, and I want to reiterate again, too, that another threat from genetically modified crops are pharmaceutical and industrial compounds that are being made in plants. Think back to that slide I showed you for pollen drift and tell me if that gives you any shivers or not. But if we've got plants out there growing that are intended to make proteins for plastics instead of for food, and that protein gets it blown into Brother Bob Jorgensen's cornfield, where he's been growing a traditional variety of corn for many years and pollinates that corn, and we consume that corn, what are we doing? What are we getting into our systems? Let alone all the medicinal compounds and products that are being developed. We have plants modified with human genes. Someone asked me about this last night, and I wanted to point this out to you, that we know here in the U.S. we've worked with corn, rice, apples, and tobacco, all containing human genes. I mentioned that there's a field trial not far from here to the east where there is a field of rice growing with human genes incorporated into that rice. We've also modified animals with human genes, primarily for medical purposes. In the case of pigs, it's to develop organs that are less likely to be rejected from people that need transplants. We have goats, pigs, cattle, chickens, mice, sheep, and others. What are the others? We don't know. It's CBI. CBI means confidential business information. They don't have to reveal it to the government. The government does not have to reveal it to us. This mouse in the lower left corner here, or the lower right corner, has human genes in it. This is a map of the United States with the listing in numbers of crops that were tested last year with either pharmaceutical or industrial properties. These are not all the GM tests. These are simply tests done for pharmaceutical or industrial purposes. We're sitting in North Carolina today. We can see that last year there were 13 tests in the state of North Carolina. Where were they? Anybody know? I don't either. And we won't know. So when you're looking for that place to buy your property, you might want to study this map and end up in some place like Montana or Wyoming, at least this year. This map is ever changing from season to season, too. I want to point out down at the bottom we show Puerto Rico with how many? Can you see that? 39, and Hawaii with 40. Why do you suppose that is? Why do you suppose? Isolation. Isolation. These companies do not want to run the risk necessarily of contaminating Farmer Brown's field of corn with a potential life-threatening genetic trait in a crop, so they are seeking isolated areas to some degree in which to grow these crops. And two of those isolated areas are the island of Kauai in Hawaii and in Puerto Rico. Another aspect of genetic technology that's quite disturbing are what we call GERTs, or genetic use restriction technologies. It's also known as Terminator Seed. Have any of you heard this term? This is seed that is genetically modified to self-destruct in the second generation. Meaning that if I plant a seed of genetically modified Terminator corn this year, it will produce an ear of corn. But if I save a seed from that ear of corn and try to plant it the next year, it will be sterile. It will not grow. It will not grow. There has been a lot of resistance in the world community against this type of technology because they recognize the potential threat this provides for famine on an incredible scale. Now also consider this, if these technologies are approved, and by the way, Canada supports this, and there are many within the US that support this, and unless we're vigilant and vocal, this is likely to be accepted by our government in the not too distant futures. One of the patent holders in the US of this technology is our own Department of Agriculture. But consider the potential for the disaster that might occur should this technology become approved, farmers start growing this on a wide scale, and we have widespread contamination from pollen drift. The potential is very serious. GMOs are the only pollution that grows. If we have an oil tanker that spills its oil off the coast, we can go out over time and dilute some of that oil and try to clean up some of that oil, but it doesn't expand and get bigger and bigger and bigger. When we release a genetically modified food product into the environment, just the opposite thing happens. It gets bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger every year. In the year 2001, the first incidence of a genetically modified food accident occurred. There was a variety of corn called Starlink that was introduced, by the way, by Aventis, the seed company Aventis, that had been approved by our government for an animal feed, but it was not approved for human consumption. It was feared that if humans consumed this particular corn variety, that it would elicit a food allergy. So therefore, it was not approved for human consumption. This points out in and of itself that the regulatory agencies have no idea what it is they're trying to regulate, because in our food system, all of the corn is commingled. If you're growing corn in Madison County, North Carolina, or Madison County, Virginia, or Madison County, Wisconsin, when you harvest your corn, you take it to the local grain elevator, it gets dumped in a big storage tank, and when your neighbor's corn comes in and the truckload after you, it gets dumped in the same corn storage tank. It goes from that corn storage tank into rail cars and gets shipped to a regional processor somewhere, but it's all mixed up. There's no way to separate the two. The government didn't realize that. What an oversight. Any farmer in the country could tell you that there was potential for that kind of a mix-up, but the government in charge of the regulation did not foresee this happening, but it happened. So what did they decide to do? Well, you know, when General Motors issues a bad product, they issue a recall. So yeah, let's do that. Let's recall all the Starlink corn. Okay, where is it? Well, we find a little bit here and a little bit there and we're a little bit more over here. They think they recalled most of it. They think they did. But today, last year, in 2006, it was estimated that about 11% of all the corn grown in the United States has this Starlink characteristic. How did that happen? It happened because a little grain of that corn got stuck in a seed bag here and another grain got stuck in a seed bag there. This farmer planted it. That corn produced pollen. That pollen pollinated 30 or 40 ears of corn in that field and 30 or 40 ears in that field, and that was harvested and saved for seed for the next year, and it grew and it grew and it grew and it grew. And there's no way to get it back. No way to get it back. Do we need genetically modified technology? The arguments from the seed companies, from the pharmaceutical companies, from the large agricultural processors is that, whoa, brothers and sisters, we got a population that's booming. We're 6.5 billion people on the planet right now. We got people starving all over the place. How are we going to feed them unless we revolutionize our technology? And boy, this genetically modified food is the way to go. We can grow more and better food this way. We got to do it. It's our moral obligation and duty to do it. Well, I'm not a fan of these two organizations, but they did a study back in 2001 to try to determine what the food production potential was of the land that is currently under cultivation, or was currently under cultivation in 2001. They determined that if proper growing techniques were applied, proper mean generally accepted cultivation practices and inputs, that acreage could support 600 billion people, 100 times the world's current population. That's with current technology and current methods. Well, why are people starving? It's because we can't produce enough food, isn't it? No, it's not. It's because of social, economic, and other forces that are at play in suppressing the distribution of food. Genetically modified animals. You're going to notice something a little peculiar about these two pigs on the bottom. They've got fluorescent green noses. That's not paint. That's a fluorescent green gene from a jellyfish that was inserted into these pigs, into the embryos of these pigs, so that they would know if they expressed this gene for a fluorescent green nose, that they also carry the gene for another type of medical purpose that they might have. It's a marker gene. So when the pigs are born, the one with the green nose they know has the genetic modification. The normal pig does not. The mouse up here, as I said, is a mouse that was modified with a human gene. The bollworms. These are bollworm larvae on the other side, and this is another area of concern to us because there's a lot of work going on with arthropods right now in genetic modification. The bollworms were specifically bred as a control technique. Bollworms cause a lot of problems in cotton, and they were trying to develop a strain of bollworm that, much like the Terminator Seed, would go out and breed with other bollworms and render a generation that was sterile. And the fluorescent bollworms are the ones that acquired that trait. Those, by the way, have been released into the environment. They're not fully approved yet, but they were approved for a test release in Texas. All right, GMOs, one battlefront. The next battlefront, this is something too that's in the news a lot these days. How many of you bought spinach 2 or 3 months ago? Anybody pay attention to what happened in the news during the E. coli outbreak in spinach? Virtually all the spinach on all the shelves in all of America vanished for about 3 weeks because of contamination from a bacteria called E. coli 0157H7. This is a picture of it. This particular variety of E. coli did not exist, by the way, before 1982. Nobody ever knew that it existed before 1982. And they think that it probably evolved from strains of E. coli that had always been present in cattle, but because of the massive antibiotic injections and the food regimen that they put feedlot cattle on, it provided a perfect opportunity for this particular type of E. coli to mutate into a far more virulent form. This E. coli was found on some spinach that was produced in California, organic spinach, I might add, that was produced in California. And immediately they started testing spinach all over the country, and it started showing up in spinach samples from all over the country. So essentially every fresh spinach source in the United States dried up for about 3 weeks. They traced it back to a facility in Northern California in the city of San Juan Bautista, and they determined that that was the source of contamination for all these different brands and types of spinach that had been contaminated with E. coli. And what they discovered was kind of an interesting circumstance. There's a large processing facility in San Juan Bautista that processes about 90% of all the spinach that's grown in the United States. So essentially what we're doing is we're washing our spinach for the whole country in one sink. And when that sink got dirty, it poisoned the spinach for the whole country. This was a problem, particularly since it occurred in organic spinach. Just recently in the news, too, we've had some other indications of problems. We found E. coli in shallots and lettuce within the last 2 weeks. These are all within the last 2 weeks. Salmonella in peanut butter. Big peanut butter recall last week. Anybody read about that? Pay attention to it. Listeria in chicken and a variety of baby food. Organic baby food, again, has been recalled because of a strain of botulinum. Why is this important to us? It's important because of a big push that's on the desk of FDA approval officers right now, leading to the potential for the irradiation of all fresh food products. This emblem that you see on the upper left here is called the Radura, and it's been used for some time now for irradiating certain types of meat. A lot of the meat companies have realized that the potential for contamination in meat is very, very high, so they have been irradiating their meat for some of their customers and charging a slightly higher price from it, guaranteeing that it is free of pathogens. It no longer has the potential to make you sick. What I want to point out here is a couple of things. First off, when we talk about irradiating produce, it does not mean that we are making the produce radioactive. What it means is that we are passing radiation through the produce. And in most cases, they use an electron gun that fires a very powerful beam of radiant energy through the produce, typically an X-ray. However, the amount of irradiation that is used is, in the case of chicken here, it says it's about 7 million times more powerful than a chest X-ray to sterilize chicken. They want to do this to our produce too, to eliminate the potential for all these sources of contamination. Sounds good, doesn't it? To be able to buy produce that's sterile, that we don't have to worry about eating? No, it doesn't sound too good to me, because the reason this technology works, by the way, Sadex Corporation is the one that is providing the equipment for doing this. Sadex. If you are dosing the bacteria and the viruses with sources of irradiation that are powerful enough to disrupt the cellular processes, the DNA, the protein bonds within that organism you're trying to kill, you're also damaging the produce itself and dramatically reducing its food value. So once again, we have the consequence of these new technologies diminishing the quality of the food that we have to eat. These are the various approvals to date for irradiation on food. It's been used on wheat flour since 1963. Most of us don't know that some of the products that we've been eating, even up to this point, have been treated with irradiation. Pork was approved in 1986. They have since rescinded that approval because they discovered that pork that was irradiated, for some reason, bacon specifically, turned rancid really fast. And they don't know why, except for the fact that they were breaking all the bonds within the fat of that pork and allowing it to rot and spoil very quickly. Didn't make sense to them at the time, so they've rescinded that approval. But some fruit and vegetables for insect control and shelf life, herbs and spices have been treated with irradiation, particularly imported herbs and spices, poultry and meats. Currently, there is a proposal on the table of the Food and Drug Administration to approve irradiation of all fresh food products. Fruit, vegetables, imported, domestic, the whole gamut. Now, the dilemma this presents to me as a grower. I grow food at a small Bible college in Central Virginia, but I also grow product that I sell to health food stores nearby. If the FDA approves this technology and says that in order for me or anybody to sell produce to protect the health of Americans, we are now going to require that you irradiate that produce. Can I sell my produce? If I do not have a farm and I'm sitting around the table with my family as a health-conscious, health-aware, convicted Seventh-day Adventist, can I go to the grocery store and buy my produce? Brother Franklin spoke to you a couple of days ago about a time of no buy and no sell. In terms of the basic constituent of our health and lifestyle, that could happen as soon as tomorrow. As soon as tomorrow. Let that sink in. This scares me. This scares me more than biotechnology. I know that if I am careful and considerate, and if I do proper planning, and if I educate myself properly, I can minimize the consequences of biotechnology in my health. But if this passes, my livelihood goes with it. I can no longer grow crops for profit, and I'm out of business. And so is every other convicted organic grower in the country too, I might add. So brothers and sisters, it's time. Wake up. Hello. No more is it good enough just for you to pot a couple of tomato plants on the back porch and say you've got a garden. No more is it adequate for you to toy around with thinking about whether you want to take responsibility for producing some of your own food. It's here. It's now. I mentioned yesterday, and I'll just say quickly again, that I believe that there is a link to industrial food and obesity. We know that obesity is the single biggest health problem here in the United States, and I wonder why. Is it because we're all a bunch of self-willed, selfish, pig-headed people that can't control our appetites? There may be an element to that, but I maintain no, that's not the case. The reason so many people, including our own brothers and sisters living on a vegan diet, are struggling with weight problems is because we're not getting nutrition from our food anymore. I know, for example, that if I go for a period of time without eating the right balance of foods, I'll start to develop a craving for something. For me, typically it's spinach. I don't know why. Maybe I'm iron deficient. But I know when my body is telling me I need some spinach. And if I eat that spinach, my body is satisfied and I go on my merry way. If I don't eat that spinach, I'm ravenous for anything that's around while I'm looking for whatever it is in that spinach that has the constituent that my body needs. So I'll eat nuts, I'll eat kale, I'll eat carbohydrates, I'll eat anything, trying to find satisfaction for that craving of my body. And if it doesn't happen, before I know it, I get on the scale and I'm 5 pounds heavier than I was. And I think that's what's happening to us here in America. Our soils are depleted of the nutrition because of modern farming practices. Our soils are no longer yielding up their strength to the plants that we eat. The crops have been hybridized and genetically modified to produce the maximum amount of crop per acre rather than any consideration for taste or quality or nutritional value. So consequently, the nutritional value of the food that's typically available to us has plummeted in the last 40 or 50 years. It's far less. What's the solution to that? Natural food, ripened, and nutrient-rich. Ripe food is nutrient-rich food. That's the other advantage to growing your own food, is the nutritional quality, even on poor soils, is better than what you're get in the store because the plant can be fully ripe. It doesn't have to travel all those miles. I know we're running out of time here, but I think all of you will be interested in this, and I want to share with you a little bit about what this little green seal on the bottom here means, the USDA organic seal. Can you all see it? I think all of you are probably familiar with it. I want to explain how a crop gets that seal and exactly what that seal means, because I think there's a lot of misinformation in our minds about what that stands for. There are 4 organizations involved in the process of acquiring this seal. This seal is issued by the United States Department of Agriculture. And all that seal means is that the product on which that seal is placed complies with regulations of the USDA. That's all it means. What are those regulations? Frankly, they vary from time to time. How are those regulations arrived at? It starts the process with the OMRI, the Organic Materials Review Institute. This is a group of private individuals that have formed an association to evaluate various different components and constituents, both in processing of food and in growing of food, for the determination of whether it is organic or not. This consists of some growers, some food processors, and some others that have interests in the food industry. They make recommendations at that point to a national organization called the National Organic Standards Board. The NOSB is administered by the USDA, but it is not part of the USDA. And it consists of some university scientists involved in food production and the food industry, again, industry representatives from both the food processing industries, food retailers, and some growers. They refine the recommendations of the Organic Materials Review Institute and submit their own regulations to the United States Department of Agriculture for approval. USDA reviews the recommendations of NOSB and in general approves them. It's never altered those recommendations to this point in time. And the USDA then passes those regulations on to the National Organic Program, or NOP, which is the administrative arm of the USDA to enforce those regulations. Now, we have an interesting problem developing in the United States. More and more people are becoming health conscious and want organic food. Good thing. Good thing that people are health conscious, and good thing that we want good quality food to eat. However, because of that interest, and because organic food tends to sell at slightly higher prices than conventional food, we've got a couple of big names that want to get into this game too. Walmart and Safeway. Who are going to be the 2 retailers left in a couple of years? Walmart and Safeway. So what's their response to this? Well, Walmart, for example, went to Kellogg's Corporation and said, we'd like you to develop a line of organic cornflakes for us. And Kellogg said, yeah, sure, we'd like to do that for you. Walmart's a big company. We can make lots of money on this. So Kellogg's goes out and they buy up all the organic corn they can find in the country and make cornflakes out of it. and Walmart starts selling it. And it's a good selling item, and before long the shelves are empty. And Walmart goes to Kellogg's and they say, Kellogg's, we want you to make some more organic corn flakes. And Kellogg says, well, I'd like to, but I can't because there's no organic corn out there left. So Walmart says, well, let's go to the USDA and see if we can solve this problem. So they approach the USDA and say, USDA, we spent a lot of money in promoting this product and developing this product, and I know that you've got standards for organic products, but you know, we're going to take a real big loss if we don't have organic cornflakes to sell. So how about letting us make cornflakes out of conventional corn and calling them organic until we can get organic corn again? And by the way, we're a big retailer, and we've got lots of money and lots of lawyers, so if you don't agree with us, you know, we can make this kind of uncomfortable for you. So the USDA says, well, you know, that might not be such a bad idea. Well, how long can we use this organic label on this corn product that is now no longer organic? Well, it takes a full year to grow a crop of corn. I think we should be able to do that for a year. And USDA said, okay. So just because your box of cornflakes has this seal on it does not necessarily mean it's organic. And by the way, one of the standards of organic food is that it is not genetically modified. And if you're using this as a standard to determine whether you're safe from genetically modified foods, you're going to be wrong if they have substituted conventional corn. So brothers and sisters, are we safe anymore? No, we're not. No, we're not. If you have any further questions about this, I'd be glad to talk with you about them after the meeting, but I need to finish up here because I'm running over my time. Where do we go for good food? First and foremost, brothers and sisters, we got to go to our gardens. We've got to. And for those of you that haven't started this process, start it. You've got a good opportunity. We're just coming into the season now where you can start making some good plans, getting some earth tilled, talking to some of us that can help direct you towards where to find seeds, supplies, and other things that are safe, and we can help you, and we'll be glad to. But get started. Do it now. As we said in the fertilizer industry, put it on. Don't put it off. It doesn't do you any good unless you put it on. In the meantime, where can you go? Local farmers markets, direct to consumer. Farmers markets have sprung up all over the country in virtually every community of any size any longer, and you can often buy food products from local growers. Does that guarantee it's safe? Absolutely not. But what it does guarantee you is the opportunity to stand there toe-to-toe and look the grower in the eye and ask him questions and say, do you use pesticides on your crop? If so, what kind? You know, why? And you know, I'm not saying to do that in a fashion where you're interrogating the poor guy, because he's just trying to make a living and do the best job he can too, but you can at least get some input and information about it. And it's going to be fresh, and it's going to have some nutrition left in it. So make use of your local farmers markets. Despite the problem, yes?
That also encourages them to grow what you're asking.
Absolutely, because their constituency is you. And just as I pointed out last night, that all of us are part of this problem too, because we've been voting with our wallets over time and supporting these industries. When you start supporting your local grower, you're going to find that he will do his best to try to meet your needs. Despite the problems with the USDA organic system, I still advocate eating organic over eating conventionally produced foods, particularly staple products and products that are not processed and not refined. That box of cornflakes may be genetically modified because it's a processed food. But if I go and buy cornmeal itself and it has that organic seal, it's likely not genetically modified. The more ingredients a product has, the more likely it is to contain genetically modified ingredients. And even something that is organic or certified organic that is a processed material, such as a spaghetti sauce, for example, that's made with organic tomatoes, it may have genetically modified yeast, enzymes, or bacteria or processing agents in it. Any of the processing ingredients do not have to meet that specification. So buy pure products. Simple food, brothers and sisters, simply prepared. That was our counsel. Let's follow it. The third one I want to recommend to you is the bottom one here called Local Harvest. This is a website, localharvest.org. And there is a link to this website from my Berea Gardens website. There are links to all the information sources I've used here today on the Berea Gardens website. With local harvest, you can type in your zip code and it's going to return to you an array of farms, stores, places within your area that believe in the buy local, sell local concept that you can support, which is similar to the farmer's market type of regime, and provides you with some alternatives to shopping at the local food lion of Babylon or Walmart. And I strongly encourage that you take these steps. Yes?
That health food store, the gentleman health food store up in Bristol, mentioned that a lot of the tobacco farmers in Virginia have been going over to organic farming of produce.
Mm-hmm.
What problems are there with that?
None. That's wonderful. I'm glad to hear that. In order for them to truly comply with the organic standards, the land has to be fallow for 3 years. In 3 years' time, most of the pesticides that would have been used in tobacco production would have decomposed. And no, it's no less dangerous than anything else. No, I think that's a wonderful thing to hear. All right, I want to recommend a book to you for those of you that want to follow up on this. There was a book written by a journalist named Jeffrey Smith that is an excellent resource for further information on this topic. I have a few copies of this book for sales downstairs. In fact, it's a real bargain. You can get it for less than the list price for the book, considerably less. And you can read more about some of the information I presented today here. I again want to remind you of the website that I have where you can find more information about all of these topics too. And if you do have questions or other concerns as you get into the process of taking responsibility for your own food production, please feel free to email me. I may not be able to respond as quickly as you like. I have lots of responsibilities and duties. But my mission, the reason that God preserved me and called me out of darkness, is to share this message with you and to provide you with the tools necessary for you to start to take some steps on your own. And brothers and sisters, I want to know how many of you have a garden. How many of you gardened last year? Okay. How many of you grew more than 10 different things in your garden last year? How many of you eat something from your garden every day, including now? Excellent. How many of you have a combination of fruits, grains, nuts, and cereals in your garden? Okay. Somehow all the hands drop when I start getting to the staple crops. There's one back there. Praise the Lord. Praise the Lord. Let's not fool ourselves this growing season into thinking that growing a little patch of lettuce, a few zucchini squash, and a couple of tomato plants is following the Lord's counsel. Let's not fool ourselves in that regard. Brothers and sisters, no matter what it takes, no matter how we do it, just as Brother Easton pointed out this morning, the importance of starting our ministry with our families, we have to simultaneously start our family ministries with the land and with the responsibility that we have to feed ourselves in a way that is going to allow us to maintain our health, our vigor, and our discernment to accomplish the tasks that we're talking about here in educating not only our young people but ourselves too as we approach the end of time. Much of what I shared with you today is pretty daunting, and I know it's pretty intimidating to a lot of us. The reason it's this way is because we have for so long ignored the counsel that we had over 100 years ago telling us, pay attention. This is the A, B, and C of education. But through time and pressures from society, we've turned our backs on that. There's a price to pay for that. And that price to pay is our extra effort now in taking remedial steps to relearn what it is that we should have learned all along. And it's not going to be any easier now. We have a lot of information sources available to us, but all of the oral tradition from our parents, our grandparents, our great-grandparents, by and large, is missing in most of our families. We have a missing chunk of time that we have wasted. And we will still be held accountable for how we proceed from here. Not having that knowledge is no longer an excuse. Not having the time is no longer an excuse. We must choose this day who we will serve. And the time, as I said, is right upon us when we will have a circumstance of no buy and no sell, particularly with our food. It's here. We've known it's coming. Why are we surprised? It's just here. So praise the Lord that He's faithful. Praise the Lord that He's given us the signs to show us. Praise the Lord that we have the blessed hope. I'd like to ask you to kneel with me in prayer, if you would. Loving Father in heaven, Lord, there's so much going on all around us, and it seems that the forces of evil are marshaled everywhere about us. And Father, you gave us warning and counsel that this would occur. You told us long ago what it would take to develop our characters in a right manner to be educated for this moment in time. Father, we failed you. We've not done all that we could to secure ourselves for your kingdom in this regard. And I pray, Lord, that as we contemplate what's upon us now, that you'll strengthen us in courage, in vigor, and conviction, and faith that we must do what it is that you've asked us to do. It's time for us to step into the garden and to cheerfully and joyfully attend to the tasks that are before us. It's time for us to shed our sweat that we might feed ourselves and learn of the blessings that the soil holds for us and your tender watch care over us through that activity. It's time for us to share this opportunity with our families and our loved ones so that we can grow together and develop bonds of strength and unity that will bind us and strengthen us as we face the difficult times ahead. Father, help us to set aside those things that are superfluous in our life these days, those things that rob us of our time and of our interest and of our capacity to accomplish this task, and give us all provision that we might step into the garden this season and begin on this work. For those of us that do not have the means or do not have the facility, I pray, Lord, that you'll unite us with brothers and sisters of like mind and faith where we can practice these skills and share the message that you've shared with us as we set about these works. We know we can't do this alone, Lord. We heard our brother share with us this morning that 2 or 3 families are often needed to accomplish the tasks that you've set, even for the simplest ministries. And if the first ministry is to provide ourselves with agriculture and the products and the resources thereof, then that means that we have to unite together too. Father, we need to set aside ourselves. We need to allow you to fill us with your Holy Spirit to provide the guidance and the strength and the wisdom. And Father, we need to do our part. And my prayer is that all of us will make that choice as to who we will serve this day. Be with us now and bless us. Be with the speakers for the remainder of this meeting, and be with all those that might be traveling on their way here for what we anticipate to be a blessed Sabbath tomorrow. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen.